September 20th, 1946, late morning, the Oval Office of the White House, Washington. President Harry Truman sat behind his desk, the morning light filtering through the tall windows behind him. His hand rested on a single sheet of paper. A resignation letter, pre-written, ready for signature. The door opened. Henry Wallace walked in. Age 57, former Vice President of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt, former Secretary of Agriculture, current Secretary of Commerce for 8 more minutes. Anyway, Wallace had known this meeting was coming. Everyone in Washington knew. The newspapers had been demanding his head for a week. Editorial writers called him naive, dangerous, a Soviet sympathizer. Conservative senators wanted him fired immediately. Liberal Democrats wanted him protected. Truman was caught in the middle of a political firestorm, and there was only one way out. 8 days earlier, Wallace had delivered a speech at Madison Square Garden in New York that contradicted American foreign policy while the Secretary of State was in Paris negotiating with the Soviet Union. The speech called for accommodation with Stalin. It criticized military buildup. It urged recognition of Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. And most damaging of all, President Truman had publicly approved it before realizing what it actually said. Now Truman needed to fix his mistake. Wallace had to go. The letter was ready. Wallace would sign it. The firing would be announced within the hour. The press was already gathering in the briefing room, sensing blood in the water. What most Americans watching this drama unfold didn't understand was that this wasn't really about one speech. This wasn't about one mistake at one rally. This was the culmination of 18 months of rising tension between two men who had inherited Franklin Roosevelt's legacy and disagreed fundamentally about what that legacy meant. They represented two completely different visions for America's role in the post-war world. One vision would shape the next 45 years of global politics, creating the framework for containment, NATO, the Marshall Plan, and everything that became known as the Cold War. The other vision would be relegated to the footnotes of history, remembered mainly as a cautionary tale about naivety and dealing with totalitarian regimes. The man walking into Truman's office that morning had been one of the most powerful politicians in America just 2 years earlier. Henry Wallace was born October 7, 1888 in Iowa. He came from agricultural royalty. His grandfather founded Wallace's Farmer magazine. His father served as Secretary of Agriculture under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. Young Henry inherited the family passion for farming science. After graduating from Iowa State College in 1910, he took over editing the family magazine. But Wallace wasn't just a journalist. He was a scientist. Between 1913 and 1933, he conducted breakthrough experiments in corn breeding. In 1926, he created the Hybrid Corn Company, the first company to market high-yield, disease-resistant hybrid corn for commercial sale. His innovations would eventually help feed millions. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt appointed Wallace as Secretary of Agriculture. Wallace was 44 years old and about to implement some of the most controversial policies of the New Deal as Agriculture Secretary. Wallace oversaw the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The program involved deliberate destruction of crops and livestock to prevent overproduction and stabilize farm prices. At a time when 25% of Americans were unemployed, destroying food seemed insane to many people. Wallace received death threats. Farmers protested, but the policy worked. Farm prices rebounded. Rural America stabilized. Wallace became one of Roosevelt's most trusted advisors. He supported every Roosevelt initiative, even the highly controversial court packing plan in 1937 that would have expanded the Supreme Court in 1940. When Roosevelt decided to run for an unprecedented third term, he needed a new running mate. His current vice president, John Nance Garner, had broken with Roosevelt over the New Deal's expansion. Roosevelt chose Wallace. The selection shocked the Democratic Party. Wallace had limited political experience outside agriculture. He was seen as too liberal, too idealistic, too much of a dreamer. Opposition to his nomination at the Democratic Convention was so strong that Wallace didn't even deliver an acceptance speech. But Roosevelt insisted. With the president's backing, Wallace secured the nomination. The Roosevelt-Wallace ticket won in a landslide in November 1940. As vice president from 1941 to 1945, Wallace's influence grew dramatically. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt expanded Wallace's responsibilities far beyond the ceremonial duties typically assigned to vice presidents. Wallace became a member of Roosevelt's War Cabinet. He chaired the Board of Economic Warfare, responsible for procuring strategically important materials from around the world. Roosevelt sent him on diplomatic missions to Latin America, China, and the Soviet Union. Wallace had a vision. He called it the Century of the Common Man. In a famous speech delivered May 8, 1942 at the Free World Association in New York, Wallace laid out his philosophy. The war wasn't just about defeating the Nazis, it was about creating a new world order based on global peace, prosperity, and equality. Common people everywhere, not just elites and corporations, would share in the world's resources and opportunities. The speech resonated with millions of Americans. Wallace became wildly popular with liberal Democrats, labor unions, and progressive activists. But Wallace made powerful enemies. Conservative Democrats, especially from the South, despised his liberal views. Business leaders opposed his economic policies. Most damaging was his bitter bureaucratic war with Jesse Jones, the conservative Secretary of Commerce. The two men fought constantly over war production and supply policies. Roosevelt, exhausted by the infighting, dissolved Wallace's Board of Economic Warfare in 1943. It was Wallace's first major political defeat. By 1944, Roosevelt was seriously ill. Everyone close to him knew it, though few said it publicly. Roosevelt suffered from severe hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and congestive heart failure. His blood pressure readings were dangerously high, sometimes reaching 200/100. His hands trembled. He had lost significant weight. His face looked gaunt and gray in photographs. His doctors privately gave him less than a year to live. They were almost exactly right. He would die 10 months after his fourth inauguration. The question of who would be vice president in Roosevelt's fourth term wasn't a theoretical political question. It was a practical question about who would become president of the United States probably within the next year. Everyone in the Democratic Party understood this. The choice of vice president in 1944 would determine who led America through the final phase of World War II and the entire post-war period. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Democratic Party leaders panicked at the thought of Henry Wallace in the Oval Office. They considered him too liberal, too sympathetic to labor unions, too friendly to the Soviet Union, too unpredictable, too much of a dreamer. Conservative Democrats, especially from the South, despised Wallace's support for racial equality and his criticism of Jim Crow laws. Business leaders feared his economic populism and his willingness to regulate corporations. Most damaging was the perception, partly fair and partly unfair, that Wallace was naive about Stalin and the Soviet threat. In May 1944, Wallace had embarked on a goodwill tour of Soviet Siberia, visiting about 20 cities over several weeks. It was an official diplomatic mission approved by Roosevelt to strengthen the wartime alliance. But what Wallace saw during that trip, or more accurately, what he was allowed to see, became a source of ridicule and concern that would haunt him for years. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, prepared for Wallace's visit by staging elaborate deceptions. The most notorious was at Magadan, a slave labor camp in northeastern Siberia where thousands of political prisoners worked in brutal conditions, many dying from cold, starvation, and execution. The NKVD transformed Magadan into a pumpkin village for Wallace's visit. They brought in actors and NKVD officers to play the role of happy workers. They staged demonstrations of supposedly voluntary labor. They created fake dormitoirs with comfortable beds and good food. They had all evidence of the Gulag system. Wallace, completely fooled, was enormously impressed. He wrote in his trip report that Magadan was like a combination of the Tennessee Valley Authority and Hudson's Bay Company, a model of productive cooperation between government and enterprise. The comment would be quoted against him for the rest of his life. Soviet records released after the Cold War showed that everything Wallace had been shown at Magadan was staged. He had praised one of Stalin's most brutal concentration camps while thinking he was seeing socialist progress. The incident raised serious questions about Wallace's judgment and his willingness to believe Soviet propaganda. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago in July 1944, party bosses launched a coordinated campaign to dump Wallace from the ticket. Robert Hannigan, the Democratic National Committee or chairman, led the effort. Big city political machines, Southern segregationist Democrats, and conservative business interests all worked together to block Wallace's renomination. They couldn't afford to have Wallace become president when Roosevelt died. Roosevelt, too exhausted and too ill to fight them, eventually acquiesced. He told party leaders he would be happy with Wallace as his running mate, but if they wanted someone else, he'd also be happy with Supreme Court Justice William Douglas or Senator Harry Truman of Missouri. Roosevelt's unwillingness to fight for Wallace sealed the outcome. The party bosses immediately chose Truman, a moderate senator from a border state who offended nobody and had solid credentials as chairman of the Senate Committee investigating war production waste. On the convention floor, Wallace's supporters staged a passionate but ultimately futile fight. They believed correctly that Roosevelt owed Wallace loyalty after for years of dedicated service as vice president. They believed also correctly that the party bosses were subverting the will of Democratic voters, many of whom strongly supported Wallace. When Wallace gave his speech to the convention delegates seconding Roosevelt's nomination, the crowd erupted with genuine enthusiasm. The organist played music. Delegates chanted Wallace's name. For 40 minutes, the convention hall shook with pro-Wallace demonstration. If the vote for vice president had been held at that moment, Wallace might have won, but the convention leadership quickly adjourned for the night, preventing any vote. By the next day, the bosses had the votes lined up for Truman. Wallace was out, Truman was in. The Roosevelt-Truman ticket won the November 1940 election. On January 20, 1945, Wallace administered the oath of office to Truman as vice president, the man who had replaced him. Wallace believed party leaders had stolen the nomination from him. He was right, but he supported Roosevelt's decision publicly and remained loyal to the administration. Roosevelt, perhaps feeling guilty about abandoning Wallace, offered him any cabinet position except Secretary of State. Wallace asked for Secretary of Commerce. The position held by his old enemy, Jesse Jones, Roosevelt agreed. After contentious Senate hearings where conservatives attacked Wallace's liberal policies, he was confirmed in March 1945 as Secretary of Commerce. Wallace expected to play a major role in transitioning the American economy from wartime to peacetime production. 23 days later, everything changed. April 12, 1945, Warm Springs, Georgia. Franklin Roosevelt was sitting for a portrait painting in the Little White House. It was 1:15 in the afternoon. Roosevelt complained of a terrible headache. He pressed his hand to the back of his skull. He said softly, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Then he slumped forward in his chair, unconscious. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke so severe that he never regained consciousness. He died at 3:35 in the afternoon. He was 63 years old. He had served as president for 12 years, 1 month, and 8 days. No American president had ever served longer. None ever would again. News of Roosevelt's death spread across America within minutes. Radio programs were interrupted with breaking bulletins. Newspapers printed special editions. People gathered in public squares, shocked and grieving. Roosevelt had led America through the Great Depression and World War II. To millions of Americans, he was the only president they could remember. The nation was about to face victory in Europe within weeks and final victory over Japan within months. But Roosevelt wouldn't see it. Harry Truman was in the Capitol building that afternoon, presiding over the Senate as vice presidents traditionally did. He was in House Speaker Sam Rayburn's office having a drink when he received an urgent message. The White House operator had called. He needed to come to the White House immediately. No explanation. Just come now. Truman sensed something terrible had happened. He arrived at the White House at 5:25 in the afternoon. He was escorted to Eleanor Roosevelt's sitting room on the second floor. She was waiting for him, dressed in black. She walked over to him, placed her hand on his shoulder, and said simply, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman stood frozen for a moment. His first thought was not about becoming president. His first thought was concern for Eleanor Roosevelt, who had just lost her husband of 40 years. He asked her, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor Roosevelt gave him a look of compassion mixed with concern. She replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." She was absolutely right. Truman was completely, utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. Roosevelt had kept Truman at arm's length during his 82 days as vice president. They'd had almost no substantive conversations about war strategy, foreign policy, or post-war planning. Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb until hours after becoming president. He didn't know about the agreements Roosevelt had made with Stalin and Churchill at Yalta 2 months earlier. He didn't know the details of military operations in Europe or the Pacific. He had been deliberately excluded from the inner circle of Roosevelt's wartime leadership. At 7:09 that evening in the cabinet room of the White House, Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the presidential oath of office to Harry S. Truman. Truman placed his hand on a Bible opened to the Sermon on the Mount. He took the oath in 35 seconds. His wife Bess and daughter Margaret stood nearby. Members of the cabinet watched solemnly. When Stone finished, Truman looked around the room at these men who had served Roosevelt for years, and he said something that revealed his deep insecurity about the moment. He told them, "Boys, if you ever pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." The cabinet members reassured him they would help. They would provide continuity. They would teach him what he needed to know. Truman asked them all to stay in their positions. He needed experienced advisors who understood Roosevelt's policies, who had relationships with Allied leaders who could help him navigate the final months of the war and the emerging challenges of peace. Truman kept most of Roosevelt's cabinet, including Wallace as Secretary of Commerce. Truman needed continuity. He needed experienced advisors who understood Roosevelt's policies and relationships with Allied leaders. Privately, Truman told associates that the two most important members of his political team were Wallace and Eleanor Roosevelt, both representing Roosevelt's liberal legacy and maintaining support from that wing of the Democratic Party, but Truman and Wallace had fundamentally different views about the Soviet Union, and that difference would destroy their relationship. The wartime alliance between America, Britain, and the Soviet Union had always been fragile, held together only by the common enemy of Nazi Germany. Even before the war ended, cracks appeared. Soviet troops occupied Eastern Europe as they pushed the Germans back toward Berlin. Stalin showed no intention of allowing free elections in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia. Soviet-supported communist parties seized power. Opposition politicians disappeared or were executed. The Iron Curtain was descending. In February 1946, diplomat George Kennan sent his famous long telegram from the American embassy in Moscow. Kennan, who had served in the Soviet Union for years, warned that Stalin's regime would never cooperate peacefully with the West. Soviet ideology demanded hostility toward capitalism. The Kremlin viewed the world as inherently divided between socialism and capitalism and believed conflict was inevitable. The only language the Soviet Union understood, Kennan argued, was strength. America needed a policy of containment using political, economic, and, if necessary, military power to prevent Soviet expansion. Truman read the long telegram. So did his Secretary of State, James Burns. They found Kennan's analysis convincing. By early 1946, Truman was moving toward a harder line against the Soviet Union. Henry Wallace disagreed completely. Wallace believed Stalin's aggression stemmed from fear, not ideology. The Soviet Union had lost between 20 and 27 million people during World War II. Soviet cities had been destroyed. The Soviet economy was devastated. Stalin feared another invasion from the West. His occupation of Eastern Europe was defensive, not aggressive. If America treated the Soviet Union with respect, recognized their legitimate security interests, and offered economic cooperation, Stalin would reciprocate. Confrontation would only provoke Stalin and lead to another war. Wallace began writing letters to Truman urging a softer approach. On July 23, 1946, Wallace sent Truman a 12-page letter laying out his concerns. Wallace wrote that American military buildup, atomic bomb testing, and support for anti-Sikh governments in Eastern Europe were making Stalin paranoid. America should recognize Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, just as the Soviets recognized American influence in Latin America. The letter urged Truman to build mutual trust and confidence with the Soviet Union. Truman read the letter. He didn't respond directly. He filed it away. The president was moving in exactly the opposite direction. Secretary of State James Burns was in Paris negotiating peace treaties with former Axis powers. The Paris Peace Conference, which began July 29, 1946, brought together foreign ministers from 21 nations. Burns represented the United States. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov represented the USSR. The negotiations were tense. Every issue from Italian reparations to the future of Germany became a proxy battle between East and West. Burns had been one of Roosevelt's closest advisors. He served as a Supreme Court justice, then resigned to become Roosevelt's director of war mobilization, essentially the domestic czar of the American war effort. Many people, including Burns himself, expected Roosevelt to choose Burns as his running mate in 1944 instead of Truman or Wallace. When Roosevelt chose Truman, Burns felt betrayed. But Truman, recognizing Burns's experience and wanting to heal old wounds, appointed him Secretary of State in July 1945. By September 1946, Burns was exhausted. The Paris negotiations were going nowhere. Molotov blocked every American proposal. Stalin was testing Truman's resolve. Burns needed unified support from Washington to strengthen his negotiating position. On September 6, 1946, Burns traveled to Stuttgart, Germany, and delivered a major policy speech. The Stuttgart speech marked a fundamental shift in American policy. Burns announced that the United States would not allow Germany to be permanently weakened or divided. Germany needed to rebuild its economy. German industrial capacity would not be limited to prevent rearmament. Instead, Germany would be integrated into a democratic, prosperous Western Europe. The speech was a direct repudiation of Soviet demands to keep Germany weak and divided. Stalin was furious. Soviet propaganda denounced the Stuttgart speech as American imperialism. Molotov accused Burns of abandoning wartime agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam. The Paris negotiations became even more hostile. Then Henry Wallace decided to give a speech of his own. The National Citizens Political Action Committee and the Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions were left-wing organizations that supported Wallace. They scheduled a major rally at Madison Square Garden in New York for September 12, 1946. The rally, billed as a Beat Dewey event, was designed to energize liberal Democrats before the November midterm elections. Republican Thomas Dewey, who had lost to Roosevelt in 1944, was positioning himself for another presidential run in 1948. The organizers wanted a major speaker who could articulate a progressive vision. They invited Henry Wallace. Wallace accepted. He would speak about foreign policy and peace. Wallace drafted his speech in late August and early September. The speech, titled "The Way to Peace," laid out his vision for American-Soviet relations. Wallace sent the draft to President Truman on September 9th, 3 days before the scheduled delivery. He asked Truman to review it. Truman's schedule on September 9th was packed. He had back-to-back meetings with foreign dignitaries, congressional leaders, and military officials. Wallace's secretary called the White House and said the secretary needed 15 minutes with the president. Truman's staff squeezed Wallace into the schedule at 4:30 in the afternoon. Wallace arrived at the Oval Office carrying his speech. He told Truman he was giving a major address on foreign policy at Madison Square Garden in 3 days. He wanted the president's approval. Truman asked how long the speech was. Wallace said about 30 minutes. Truman looked at his watch. He had another meeting scheduled in 20 minutes. He told Wallace he couldn't read the entire speech right now, but Wallace could read him the key sections. Wallace stood in the Oval Office and read excerpts from his speech. He read the sections that criticized American policy toward the Soviet Union. He read the sections calling for recognition of Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. He read the sections warning that American military buildup was provoking Stalin. Truman barely listened. He was thinking about his next meeting. He was exhausted. He just wanted Wallace to finish so he could move on to the next item on his schedule. When Wallace finished reading, Truman said the speech sounded fine. He said Wallace could tell reporters that the president had approved it. Truman made a catastrophic mistake. He hadn't actually read the speech carefully. He didn't realize how directly it contradicted Burns's speech in current American policy. He just wanted Wallace out of his office. September 12, 1946, evening, Madison Square Garden, New York City. The arena was filling up fast. Thousands of people would pack into the building by the time the program started. They came from all over New York and the surrounding states. Minus one union members, progressive activists, liberal Democrats, Communist Party sympathizers, Soviet supporters. They all came to hear Henry Wallace speak about peace and foreign policy. The atmosphere in Madison Square Garden that night was electric but strange. Communist Party members filled many of the front rows. They held signs with pro-Soviet slogans. They wore buttons celebrating Stalin. They distributed pamphlets attacking American foreign policy. This wasn't your typical Democratic Party rally. It felt more like a Communist Party Congress that happened to be taking place in an American arena. The program began in the early evening. Various speakers warmed up the crowd. They attacked Republican policies. They praised Roosevelt's legacy. They called for progressive politics at home and abroad. The crowd cheered dutifully, but they were waiting for one man. Henry Wallace, the former vice president, the man who represented the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, the man who dared to challenge President Truman's foreign policy. Wallace took the podium. The crowd erupted. They chanted his name. They waved signs. They believed Wallace would lead them to a new era of peace and cooperation with the Soviet Union. Wallace stood at the microphone waiting for the noise to subside. He had his speech in front of him, 37 typed pages. He'd revised it multiple times over the past week. He'd sent a copy to President Truman 3 days earlier. Truman had approved it, or so Wallace believed. Wallace began speaking. His voice was calm, measured, reasonable. He wasn't a firebrand speaker. He was a policy intellectual trying to explain complex foreign relations to a passionate crowd. He talked about the dangers of war in the atomic age. He said the price of peace for America and every nation in the world was giving up prejudice, hatred, fear, and ignorance. The crowd applauded. It sounded good. It sounded idealistic and hopeful. Then Wallace moved to the controversial sections. He said American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union was too harsh, too confrontational, too likely to provoke another war. He said the United States had no more business in the political affairs of Eastern Europe than Russia had in the political affairs of Latin America, Western Europe, and the United States. He said America should recognize Soviet spheres of influence as legitimate. The communist sympathizers in the crowd roared approval. They stood and cheered. They chanted support for the Soviet Union, but then Wallace said something they didn't want to hear. He criticized Soviet suppression of civil liberties. He criticized religious persecution in the Soviet Union. He said the Soviet government needed to allow more freedom for its people. The crowd booed. They booed Henry Wallace, the man they'd come to support because he dared to criticize Stalin. Wallace was shocked. He pressed on, trying to present a balanced view of Soviet-American relations. But the crowd made it clear they wanted unconditional support for the Soviet Union, not nuanced analysis. They wanted propaganda, not policy discussion. Wallace finished his speech after speaking for over half an hour. The crowd gave him a standing ovation, but it was a complicated ovation. They loved his criticism of American policy. They hated his criticism of Soviet policy. Wallace left the stage confused about how the speech had been received. He would find out soon enough. The real crisis wasn't in the arena. It was in Washington and Paris. At 6:15 that evening, Truman held a scheduled press conference at the White House. Reporters immediately asked about Wallace's upcoming speech. They knew Wallace was giving a major foreign policy address and wanted to know if the president approved it. Truman, remembering his brief meeting with Wallace 3 days earlier, said yes. He had read the speech. He said he approved it. A reporter asked if that meant the speech represented official administration policy. Truman said yes. He approved the speech entirely. The reporters rushed out to file their stories. Within an hour, newspapers across America reported that President Truman had approved Wallace's speech calling for conciliation with the Soviet Union. The story hit European news wires immediately. By the time Wallace delivered his speech in New York, foreign governments already believed it represented official American policy. In Paris, James Burns learned about the Wallace speech and Truman's press conference endorsement from reporters at 2 o'clock in the morning Paris time. Burns was stunned. He had just delivered the Stuttgart speech 6 days earlier, laying out a firm policy toward Germany and the Soviet Union. Now Wallace, a cabinet member, was publicly contradicting that policy, and Truman had approved it. Foreign ministers at the Peasant read to the Seed Paris conference were confused. Which policy represented America's actual position? Burns's hard line or Wallace's conciliation? Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, saw an opportunity. He told other delegates that America's position was divided and weak. Burns' negotiating position collapsed. Burns cabled Truman immediately. The cable was blunt. Burns said Wallace's speech was undermining American foreign policy at the worst possible time. If the president supported Wallace's position, Burns would resign as Secretary of State. Truman couldn't have both. He had to choose. When Truman woke up on the morning of September 13th, the first thing his staff brought him was Burns's cable from Paris. Truman read it over breakfast. The full weight of his mistake hit him like a physical blow. He had approved Wallace's speech without reading it carefully. He had told reporters it represented administration policy without understanding what Wallace was actually saying. He had undermined his own Secretary of State during sensitive negotiations. He had created a foreign policy disaster through carelessness and poor judgment. Truman immediately called his press secretary, Charlie Ross, into his office. He asked Ross to get him the full text of Wallace's speech. Ross brought him a typed copy that had been distributed to the press. Truman read it carefully for the first time. With every paragraph, his anger grew. Wallace had criticized the get tough policy toward the Soviet Union. Wallace had suggested America should recognize Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Wallace had implied that Stalin's aggression was America's fault for being too militaristic. Every sentence contradicted what Burns was trying to accomplish in Paris. Truman sat at his desk and wrote in his diary. He wrote that Wallace and he had always been friendly. He wrote that he was sure Wallace wasn't trying to deliberately undermine him. He wrote that if the speech had been made by anyone else anywhere else, it would have attracted no attention. But then his statement at the press conference saying he had read and approved the speech had magnified its importance enormously. Truman wrote that he would never edit speeches again, particularly when pressed for time. He noted that Wallace had asked for only 15 minutes, but it had taken 30 minutes to read the speech, and Truman had been behind schedule with other important people waiting. It was a most unfortunate proceeding, he wrote. Truman was angry at himself as much as at Wallace. He knew he'd made the error. He'd approved something without proper review. He'd spoken carelessly at the press conference. Now he had to fix it, and there was no good solution. If he backed Wallace, he'd lose Burns and damage American credibility in negotiations with the Soviet Union. If he fired Wallace, he'd split the Democratic Party and possibly lose the midterm elections in 7 weeks. Either way, he'd look weak and indecisive. On September 14th, 2 days after the Madison Square Garden speech, Truman held another press conference. He tried to walk back his earlier statement. A reporter asked if he still approved of Wallace's speech. Truman said there had been a misunderstanding. When he told reporters 2 days ago that he approved the speech, he meant only that he approved Wallace's right to give it, not necessarily the content or the policy positions. The explanation was unconvincing to everyone in the room. The reporters knew exactly what Truman had said on September 12th. He'd been asked directly if the speech represented administration policy, and he'd said yes. Now he was trying to claim he'd meant something different. Nobody believed him. The newspapers the next morning were brutal. Editorial writers attacked Truman as confused, weak, and incompetent in managing his own administration. How could the president not know what his own foreign policy was? How could he approve a speech that contradicted his Secretary of State? How could he then claim 2 days later that he hadn't really approved it after all? Conservative newspapers demanded Wallace's immediate firing. Liberal newspapers demanded that Truman clarify his position and stop flip-flopping. Everyone agreed it was a mess. Truman received a second cable from Burns on September 15th. This one was even more blunt than the first. Burns wrote that he couldn't continue serving as Secretary of State if cabinet members openly contradicted foreign policy and the president backed them. The damage in Paris was severe. Foreign ministers didn't know what American policy actually was. Negotiations had stalled. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov was exploiting the confusion to make demands he knew Burns couldn't meet. Burns's message was crystal clear. Either Wallace goes or I go. Choose. Truman faced an impossible choice. Burns was his Secretary of State, the face of American diplomacy, the lead, a negotiator with the Soviet Union, but Wallace was hugely popular with liberal Democrats and labor unions. Firing Wallace would split the Democratic Party. The midterm elections were 7 weeks away. Democrats were already facing losses. A public fight between Truman and Wallace would guarantee disaster. Truman tried a compromise. On September 16th, he called Wallace to the White House. Truman said Wallace could keep his position as Secretary of Commerce, but he had to stop speaking about foreign policy. Wallace asked if that was an order or a request. Truman said it was an order. Wallace said he would comply. For 2 days, Truman thought he'd solved the problem, but the newspapers wouldn't let it go. Editorial after editorial demanded Wallace's resignation. Republicans attacked Truman as weak. Burns sent another cable from Paris saying he couldn't function as Secretary of State with Wallace still in the cabinet. On September 18th, Truman held a 2.5-hour meeting with Wallace at the White House. Truman later wrote in his diary that Wallace spent the entire time defending his speech and explaining why American policy toward the Soviet Union was wrong. Wallace showed no willingness to compromise or moderate his views. He truly believed Stalin could be trusted if America would just treat the Soviet Union fairly. Truman went home that evening and wrote in his diary. He wrote that he'd been left in a terrible position by his own mistake in approving the speech without reading it carefully. He wrote that he wished his cabinet members would stay in their own areas of responsibility and stop interfering with each other. He wrote that Wallace had a habit of thinking he knew better than everyone else on every subject. Truman was angry and frustrated. On September 19th, Truman called his advisors together. They discussed options. Everyone agreed Wallace had to go. The question was how to do it without maximum political damage. Clark Clifford, Truman's counsel, suggested having Wallace submit a resignation letter, make it look mutual, minimize the spectacle. On the morning of September 20th, Truman called Wallace and asked him to come to the White House. Wallace arrived at 10:23 in the morning. Truman told him directly that he needed to resign. The situation was impossible. Burns couldn't function as Secretary of State with Wallace in the cabinet. The president couldn't have to foreign policies. Wallace had to go. Wallace, according to Truman's later notes, was gracious about it. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He simply agreed to resign. Wallace wrote a brief resignation letter and signed it. The letter said he was resigning because of fundamental disagreements about foreign policy toward the Soviet Union. Truman accepted the resignation immediately. At 11 o'clock that morning, the White House issued a statement. President Truman had requested and received the resignation of Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace due to disagreements over foreign policy. Wallace was out. The firing had taken exactly 8 days from the Madison Square Garden speech to his departure from the cabinet. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party exploded in anger. Labor unions denounced Truman. Progressive activists accused the president of betraying Roosevelt's legacy. Eleanor Roosevelt, still the most respected voice in liberal Democratic circles, was disappointed but didn't publicly criticize Truman. She understood the foreign policy realities even if she sympathized with Wallace's idealism. Wallace became a martyr to the left. He took over as editor of the New Republic magazine and used it as a platform to attack Truman's foreign policy. Every week, Wallace wrote editorials denouncing the Cold War, criticizing military spending, and arguing for cooperation with Stalin. In December 1946, Wallace helped found the Progressive Citizens of America, a left-wing organization that would become the foundation for his 1948 presidential campaign. Wallace announced he would run against Truman as a third-party candidate representing the Progressive Party. The 1948 presidential election became one of the strangest in American history. Truman faced challenges from both left and right. Wallace ran on the Progressive Party ticket, attacking Truman's Cold War policies. Strom Thurmond, Democratic governor of South Carolina, ran as a Dixierat, attacking Truman's civil rights policies. Republican Thomas Dewey, confident of victory, ran a cautious campaign, avoiding specific commitments. Every poll showed Dewey winning easily. Truman's support was fragmenting. Wallace was pulling liberal votes. Thurmond was pulling Southern votes. Dewey had the middle. Political analysts wrote Truman's obituary before Election Day. Truman fought back. He barnstormed across America on a whistle-stop train tour, giving hundreds of speeches attacking the sump-do-nothing Republican Congress and defending his policies. He painted Wallace as naive about Stalin and accused the Progressive Party of being infiltrated by communists. He painted Thurmond as a segregationist dinosaur defending Jim Crow. He positioned himself as the reasonable center. On November 2, 1948, Americans voted. Wallace received approximately 1,157,000 votes, 2.4% of the total. He won 0 electoral votes. Thurmond received approximately 1,169,000 votes, 2.4%, and won 39 electoral votes from four Deep South states. Dewey received approximately 21,970,000 votes, 45.1%, and won 189 electoral votes. Harry Truman received approximately 2,416,000 votes, 49.6%, and won 303 electoral votes. Against all predictions, Truman won. He kept the White House. He vindicated his foreign policy. He proved Wallace wrong. Wallace's political career was finished. The Progressive Party collapsed. Communist influence in the party, long suspected, became undeniable. Party organizers had used materials written by the Daily Worker, the American Communist Party newspaper. Soviet sympathizers controlled much of the party apparatus. Wallace claimed he didn't know the extent of communist infiltration. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't want to know. By 1950, Wallace himself had changed his mind. When the Korean War began in June 1950, Wallace broke with the Progressive Party and endorsed Truman's decision to defend South Korea against communist invasion. In 1952, Wallace published an article titled "Where I Was Wrong." He wrote that he'd been naive about Stalin. Soviet actions in Eastern Europe blocking Berlin, supporting North Korea's invasion, showed that Stalin couldn't be trusted. Wallace admitted he'd been wrong. Truman had been right. The Cold War that Wallace wanted to prevent lasted 45 years. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The policy of containment that George Kennan recommended and Truman implemented had worked. Communist expansion was stopped. Eastern Europe eventually won freedom. Democracy spread. The century of the common man that Wallace dreamed about actually arrived, but through different means than he imagined. Henry Wallace retired to his farm in New York. He went back to agricultural experiments. He wrote about farming and genetics. He mostly stayed out of politics. He died November 18, 1965 at age 77 in Danbury, Connecticut. His obituary mentioned his service as Vice President and Secretary of Agriculture. It mentioned his hybrid corn innovations that helped feed the world. It mentioned his failed presidential campaign. It didn't mention that he'd been fired by Truman for being too soft on Stalin. Harry Truman left office in January 1953 after declining to run for another term. He returned to his home in Independence, Missouri. He built his presidential library. He wrote his memoirs. He remained active in Democratic Party politics. He lived to see his foreign policy vindicated. The Soviet Union that Wallace wanted to trust proved itself untrustworthy decade after decade. The containment policy that Truman implemented kept the peace and eventually won the Cold War. Truman died December 26, 1972 at era 88. James Burns resigned as Secretary of State in January 1947, exhausted by the Paris negotiations and frustrated with Truman's management style. He was replaced by George Marshall, who implemented the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and formalized the containment doctrine through the Truman Doctrine. Burns returned to South Carolina, was elected governor, and spent his final years fighting desegregation. He died April 9, 1972 at age 89. The Madison Square Garden speech that triggered Wallace's firing is preserved in the archives. Historians study it as an example of how not to conduct foreign policy. Having a cabinet member publicly contradict the President and Secretary of State during sensitive negotiations is considered one of the great blunders of post-war American politics. Whether Wallace was right or wrong about Stalin is debatable. That his timing was catastrophically bad is not. The Truman-Wallace split marked a turning point in American liberalism. Before 1946, liberal Democrats believed accommodation with the Soviet Union was possible. After 1946, mainstream liberalism embraced containment and anti-communism. The liberal wing that followed Wallace into the Progressive Party became marginalized. The liberal wing that stayed with Truman dominated Democratic politics for the next 40 years. The real tragedy is that both men wanted the same thing. Both wanted peace. Both wanted prosperity. Both wanted democracy to prevail. They simply disagreed about how to achieve those goals. Truman believed strength would deter aggression. Wallace believed kindness would encourage cooperation. History proved Truman right. Stalin responded to strength, not kindness. But Wallace's vision of a world without Cold War hostility, a world where great powers cooperated instead of competed, remains an ideal worth pursuing. The photo of Harry Truman and Henry Wallace together exists in the National Archives. It was taken at Roosevelt's fourth inauguration on January 20th, 1945. Wallace, still vice president for a few more hours, stands next to Truman, about to become vice president. Both men smile for the camera. Neither knows that in 8 months they'll be locked in a battle over the future of American foreign policy. Neither knows that battle will define the next half-century of global politics. That's how history actually happens. Not through grand plans or inevitable forces, but through human decisions made under pressure by imperfect people trying to do what they think is right. Sometimes the idealist is right. Sometimes the pragmatist is right. In September 1946, the pragmatist won and the world lived with the consequences for the next 45 years. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from American political history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one shaped the world we live in today. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe. From history enthusiasts to students to people who lived through these events, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories alive.